The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the ornate carpet where Kate stood frozen. Her hands trembled as she clutched the letter that had arrived just minutes before, its contents threatening to shatter everything she thought she knew about her life within the royal family. Charles entered the room with his usual measured stride, but Kate could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set in that particular manner that meant he was fighting to control his emotions. Behind him, Camilla followed quietly, her expression unreadable as always, though Kate caught the subtle way her eyes lingered on the letter in Kate's hands. "You've read it then," Charles said simply, his voice carrying the weight of years of carefully managed public relations disasters. It wasn't a question. He could see the answer written clearly across Kate's face, in the way her normally composed features had crumpled into something raw and vulnerable. Kate nodded, unable to trust her voice. The letter detailed allegations that would rock the very foundation of the monarchy, accusations that implicated not just Charles, but the entire institution she had married into. More devastating still were the personal attacks on her own character, claims about her background, and motivations that felt like daggers aimed at her heart. Camilla moved to the window, ostensibly to adjust the curtains, but Kate knew she was positioning herself where she could observe without appearing to intrude. It was a skill Camilla had perfected over decades of navigating the treacherous waters of royal life, the ability to be present without seeming to watch, to influence without appearing to interfere. "How long have you known?" Kate finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications about trust, about the secrets that seemed to multiply within these ancient walls like shadows at sunset. Charles looked older than his years in that moment, the weight of the crown invisible but heavy on his shoulders. "The rumors began circulating 3 days ago. We hoped to contain them before they reached you, before they reached William." His voice carried a note of regret that Kate had rarely heard from him, a crack in the usually impenetrable armor of royal composure. The mention of William sent a fresh wave of panic through Kate. Where was her husband? Did he know? Was he somewhere else in the castle, receiving his own devastating news, or was he still blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to engulf their family? Camilla turned from the window, her movements deliberate and calculated. "The palace will issue a statement," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had weathered many such storms. "These allegations are baseless, but we must respond swiftly and decisively." Kate felt a bitter laugh bubble up in her throat. "Baseless," she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. But were they? The letter contained details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the family could know, personal moments, and private conversations that made Kate's skin crawl with the realization that their lives were apparently not as private as they had believed. The allegations weren't just about financial impropriety or political meddling, though those charges were serious enough. They cut deeper, attacking the very essence of who Kate was, suggesting that her entire relationship with William had been orchestrated, that she was nothing more than a carefully positioned social climber who had manipulated her way into the heart of the future king. Charles began pacing, a habit Kate had noticed he fell into when the pressure became too much. Each step echoed in the vast room, a rhythmic reminder of the isolation that came with their positions. "We've faced worse," he said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as Kate. "The Diana years, the divorce, Camilla's integration into the family. We've survived it all." But Kate wasn't sure this was true. Those scandals had been different, rooted in real events and real emotions that could at least be understood, even if they couldn't be easily forgiven. This felt more insidious, like poison seeping through the very foundations of everything they had built together as a family. Camilla approached Kate slowly, her expression softening in a way that few people ever saw. Despite their complicated history, despite the years of awkwardness and careful distance, there was something almost maternal in the way she reached out to touch Kate's arm. "You're stronger than you know," she said quietly. I learned that the hard way, but you don't have to. The gesture was unexpected, and it broke something loose inside Kate that she had been holding back. The tears came suddenly, hot and unchecked, streaming down her face as the full weight of the situation crashed over her. She wasn't just crying for herself, but for William, for their children, for the life they had tried so carefully to build despite the constant scrutiny and pressure. Charles stopped pacing and turned to watch his daughter-in-law weep, his own emotions playing across his features like a storm front moving across an open field. Kate could see anger there, yes, but also something deeper and more complex. Fear, perhaps, or regret for the world they had brought her into, the price they had asked her to pay for love. Who would do this? Kate asked through her tears, looking up at Charles with eyes that pleaded for answers he might not have. Who hates us this much? The question seemed to age Charles before their eyes. He moved to his desk, his hands resting heavily on its polished surface. The list is longer than you might imagine, he said wearily. Republican activists, tabloid journalists with grudges, former staff members who felt mistreated, political opponents looking for any advantage. The monarchy has enemies, Kate. It always has. Camilla remained close to Kate, her presence somehow both comforting and unnerving. Kate had never quite known what to make of her stepmother-in-law, this woman who had been cast as the villain in one of the greatest love stories and tragedies of the modern age. Yet here she was, offering support in Kate's darkest moment. Her own experience with public persecution making her perhaps the only person in the room who truly understood what Kate was facing. The children, Kate said suddenly, a new wave of panic washing over her. George, Charlotte, Louis. They'll hear about this at school, from other children. How do we protect them from something like this? It was Charles who answered, his voice heavy with the weight of experience. We do what the royal family has always done. We endure. We maintain our dignity. We show them that these attacks, these lies cannot break us. But, even as he spoke the words, Kate could hear the doubt creeping into his voice, the uncertainty of a man who had seen his own family torn apart by public scandal and media-feeding frenzies. The letter lay forgotten on a nearby table, but its presence seemed to fill the room like a toxic cloud. Kate found herself thinking about the person who had written it, wondering what kind of hatred or desperation could drive someone to craft such a detailed and devastating attack. The allegations weren't just false, they were cruel, designed to inflict maximum emotional damage on everyone they touched. Camilla moved to pour tea from a service that had been quietly brought in, her movements precise and controlled. It was such a British response to crisis, Kate thought, with a mixture of admiration and despair. When the world falls apart, make tea. When your life is under attack, maintain the rituals that have sustained you for generations. There's something else, Charles said reluctantly, and Kate felt her heart sink even further. She wasn't sure she could handle another revelation, another layer of complexity to add to the nightmare that her mourning had become. He moved to a cabinet and withdrew another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Palace Security Office. The threats have escalated. The security team believes there may be a coordinated campaign designed not just to damage our reputation, but to endanger our safety. Kate felt the blood drain from her face. Physical danger was something she had always known was possible, but it had remained largely theoretical, a distant concern handled by professionals trained to think about such things. The idea that someone might actually want to hurt her children, transformed the abstract threat of scandal into something far more terrifying. Camilla set down the teacup she had been preparing and moved closer to Charles, her expression grave. "How serious is the threat?" she asked, her voice carrying none of the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm Kate. This was Camilla in crisis mode. Kate realized, the woman who had survived decades of death threats and public hatred. "Serious enough that they're recommending additional security measures," Charles replied. "No public appearances for any of us until they can assess the scope of the threat." The children will need to be kept home from school, at least temporarily. Kate sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The room seemed to be spinning, the elegant furnishings and priceless artwork blurring together into a kaleidoscope of gilt and silk. This couldn't be happening. Just yesterday, she had been planning George's birthday party, worrying about nothing more serious than whether the weather would hold for the outdoor activities they had planned. "Where is William?" she asked again, more urgently this time. She needed her husband, needed his steady presence and quiet strength to help her navigate this crisis. William had been born into this world of scrutiny and scandal. He understood it in ways that Kate was still learning. More than that, he loved her, and she needed that love now more than ever. Charles glanced at his watch, a gesture that seemed oddly mundane given the gravity of their situation. "He's in a security briefing. He'll be here soon." There was something in his tone that made Kate wonder if William was receiving even worse news than what she had learned from the letter. Camilla finally spoke, her voice cutting through Kate's spiraling thoughts like a lifeline. "You need to eat something," she said practically, "and rest. This is going to be a long fight, and you'll need your strength." It was such a simple, human concern that it almost made Kate cry again. In the midst of all the protocol and procedure, the political maneuvering and public relations strategies, Camilla had remembered that Kate was a person, a woman dealing with what felt like the complete destruction of her world. "I don't understand how this happened," Kate said, accepting the tea that Camilla pressed into her hands. "We've been so careful, so private. How could someone know these things, these intimate details about our lives?" Charles and Camilla exchanged a look that Kate couldn't quite read, but it sent a chill down her spine. There was knowledge there, some understanding between them that didn't include her. It made her feel more isolated than ever, a reminder that despite her years in the family, there were still secrets and subtleties that escaped her. "The palace has many employees," Charles said carefully. "Housekeeping staff, security personnel, administrative assistants. Despite all our screening procedures, it's possible that someone with access has been compromised, either financially or through blackmail." The idea that someone she trusted, someone who had been in her home, around her children, might have been systematically gathering information to use against her family made Kate feel physically ill. She thought about all the staff members she interacted with daily, people she had come to think of as extended family, and wondered which of them might have betrayed that trust. But there was something else in Charles's explanation, something that didn't quite ring true. Kate had developed good instincts about deception during her years in the royal family, where so much communication happened through subtext and carefully chosen words. Charles was holding something back, some crucial piece of information that would help her understand how this nightmare had begun. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them all turn toward the door. Kate's heart leaped with hope that it might be William, but the knock that came was too tentative, too deferential to be her husband. Charles called for whoever it was to enter, and Kate's private secretary appeared, her usually composed expression barely masking her distress. "Your Royal Highness," she said, addressing Kate directly, "I'm afraid there's been a development. The story is already online. Someone has leaked portions of the allegations to several major news outlets simultaneously." Kate felt the last of her composure crumble. She had harbored some desperate hope that they could contain the damage, manage the crisis before it became public knowledge. But if the story was already breaking, if journalists were already parsing through the accusations and preparing their coverage, then there was no going back. Charles moved to his phone immediately, his fingers flying over the screen as he presumably contacted the palace press office. Camilla remained beside Kate, her presence steady and reassuring even as everything else seemed to be falling apart. "How long do we have?" Kate asked her secretary, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "The first articles should be published within the hour," came the reply. "The palace communications team is preparing a response, but given the scope of the allegations, it may not be enough to prevent significant coverage." Kate closed her eyes and tried to imagine what the coverage would look like, how the allegations would be packaged, and presented to a public that was always hungry for royal scandal. She thought about her friends reading the stories, about her children's classmates' parents discussing the accusations over dinner, about strangers forming opinions about her character based on lies and distortions. When she opened her eyes, she found Camilla watching her with an expression of deep understanding. This woman had lived through her own media hell, had endured years of being painted as the villain in one of the most beloved royal romances of all time. If anyone understood the particular agony of having your character assassinated in public, it was Camilla. "It will pass," Camilla said quietly, though Kate noticed she didn't say when or how. "You're stronger than you know, and you have more support than you realize." Kate wanted to believe her, wanted to find comfort in the promise that this nightmare would eventually end. But sitting in that ornate room, surrounded by centuries of royal history and tradition, she couldn't shake the feeling that some damage could never be undone, that some accusations would follow her for the rest of her life, no matter how thoroughly they were debunked. The weight of the crown, invisible but ever-present, had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. William burst through the doors 20 minutes later, his face flushed from running through the corridors of the castle. Kate had never seen her husband look so disheveled, his usually perfect hair askew, and his tie loosened as if he had been tugging at it in frustration. The moment their eyes met across the room, she saw her own anguish reflected in his expression, and she knew that whatever he had learned in his security briefing had been every bit as devastating as her own revelations. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms without a word. Kate buried her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the slight tang of perspiration that spoke to his urgency in getting to her. For a moment, the world outside the circle of his embrace ceased to exist, and she allowed herself to believe that together they could weather any storm. But the illusion couldn't last. Over William's shoulder, Kate could see Charles standing rigidly by the window. His phone pressed his ear as he spoke in clipped, urgent tones to someone on the other end. Camilla had moved to a different part of the room, ostensibly to give them privacy, but Kate could see her reflection in the glass of a portrait frame, watching them with the careful attention of someone who understood that every gesture, every emotion, would need to be managed and controlled in the coming days. "How bad is it?" William whispered against her hair, his voice carrying a rawness that she rarely heard from him. As the future king, William had been trained from birth to maintain composure under pressure, but Kate could feel the tremor in his hands as he held her, the barely contained fury in the tension of his muscles. "Worse than we thought," she whispered back, and she felt him stiffen against her. She pulled back to look into his eyes, searching for some sign that he had better news than she did, some indication that the security briefing had offered solutions rather than more problems. Instead, she saw confirmation of her worst fears. William's blue eyes, usually so warm and reassuring, were clouded with an anger so intense it made her take a step backward. This wasn't the controlled irritation of a royal dealing with difficult press coverage. This was something deeper and more dangerous, the rage of a man whose family was under attack. "They have photographs," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure his father and stepmother couldn't hear. "Someone has been watching us, Kate. Watching our children." The security team found evidence of surveillance equipment that's been in place for weeks, maybe months. Kate felt her knees buckle, and only William's quick reflexes kept her from falling. The idea that their private moments, their children's innocent play, their most intimate conversations might have been recorded without their knowledge was more violating than any written accusation could ever be. Charles finished his phone call and turned back to them, his expression grim. "The press secretary is preparing a statement," he announced, "but I'm afraid the situation has become more complex. There are multiple news organizations involved, and they seem to be coordinating their coverage. This isn't random tabloid muckraking. This is organized." William's arm tightened around Kate's waist, and She could feel the effort it was taking him to keep his voice level. "Who's behind it?" he asked, though Kate suspected he already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. "We're still investigating," Charles replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested he had suspicions he wasn't ready to share. "The important thing now is damage control. We need to present a united front, show the public that these attacks haven't divided us or weakened our resolve." Camilla spoke for the first time since William had arrived, her voice cutting through the tension with practical authority. "The children need to be our first priority," she said. "George is old enough to understand that something is wrong, and if this story breaks before we can speak to them, they'll hear about it from classmates or teachers." Kate felt a fresh wave of panic at the mention of her children. George, at 10, was indeed old enough to understand scandal, even if he couldn't fully grasp its implications. Charlotte and Louis were younger, but they were bright children who picked up on adult anxiety with uncanny accuracy. How do you explain to a child that people are saying terrible things about their mother, their family, without destroying their sense of security in the world? "I want to see them," Kate said suddenly. "I need to see them before this gets worse." William nodded immediately. "They're in the nursery with their tutors. Security has been tripled, but we should speak to them ourselves before they hear it from anyone else." As they prepared to leave the room, Charles caught William's arm. "Son," he said, and Kate heard decades of royal training and personal experience in that single word. "Remember that how we handle this will define us for generations. The monarchy has survived worse scandals, but only because we learned to rise above them with dignity." Kate saw something flash across William's features, something that looked dangerously like contempt. "With respect, Father," he said, his voice tight with control, "this is different. They're not just attacking our public roles or our personal choices. They're threatening our children's safety and attacking Kate's character with lies so vicious they could destroy innocent people's lives." The tension between father and son was suddenly palpable, crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Kate realized that this crisis was revealing fault lines in the family that had perhaps been hidden beneath the surface for years. Charles, with his decades of experience managing scandal, seemed to view this as another crisis to be weathered with traditional royal stoicism. But William saw it as a more fundamental attack that required a more aggressive response. Camilla stepped into the silence that followed, her diplomatic skills honed by years of navigating similar family tensions. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we could discuss strategy later, after we've all had time to process this information fully. Right now, the children should be our immediate concern." Kate was grateful for the intervention, but she could see that the disagreement between Charles and William was far from resolved. As they made their way through the corridors toward the children's quarters, she found herself wondering if this crisis might not only destroy her own reputation, but also drive a wedge between the current king and his heir that could have implications far beyond their personal relationship. The nursery was a haven of normalcy in the chaos that had consumed the rest of their day. George was bent over a puzzle at a low table, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he worked to fit a particularly challenging piece. Charlotte was reading aloud to Louis from a picture book, her voice taking on different characters with theatrical flair that made her little brother giggle. For a moment, Kate stood in the doorway watching them, trying to memorize this scene of innocent happiness before she had to shatter it. The children's tutor, Mrs. Henderson, noticed them first and rose from her chair with a respectful nod. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had been with the family for several years, and Kate saw recognition in her eyes that this wasn't a routine visit. The gravity of the situation must have been written clearly on their faces. "Mama, Papa," Louis called out, abandoning his book to run toward them with arms outstretched. Kate swept him up in a fierce hug, inhaling the sweet scent of his hair and feeling her heart break a little more at the trust and love in his small voice. George looked up from his puzzle, his perceptive eyes taking in the tension that surrounded his parents like a dark cloud. "Is something wrong?" he asked, displaying the kind of intuitive understanding that sometimes made Kate forget how young he still was. William knelt down to George's level, while Kate settled into a chair with Louis still in her arms and gestured for Charlotte to come close. The little girl approached with the careful wariness of a child who sensed that adult concerns were about to intrude on her protected world. "We need to talk to you about something important," William began, his voice gentle but serious. Kate watched her husband struggle to find words that would prepare their children for the storm that was coming without terrifying them or destroying their innocence. "Some people are going to say things about our family that aren't true," Kate added, choosing her words carefully. "You might hear these things at school or see them on television, and we want you to know that they're lies told by people who want to hurt us." George's expression grew solemn, and Kate could see him processing this information with the kind of analytical mind that would serve him well when he eventually took on royal duties. "Why would people want to hurt us?" he asked, and Kate felt her heart break at the confusion in his voice. It was a question she wasn't sure she could answer, partly because she didn't fully understand it herself, and partly because the real answer involved concepts of power, jealousy, and political manipulation that were too complex and dark for a child to comprehend. William fielded the question with the skill of someone who had been answering difficult questions about public life since his own childhood. "Sometimes people disagree with the work that royal families do," he said, "and sometimes they try to hurt us by spreading rumors or telling lies. It doesn't mean we've done anything wrong. It just means we have to be strong and stick together as a family." Charlotte, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Like the mean things some people said about Grandmama Diana?" she asked, and Kate felt the blood drain from her face. Their daughter was too young to remember Diana personally, but she had obviously absorbed more from family conversations and media exposure than they had realized. The mention of Diana sent a visible shock through William, and Kate saw his jaw clench with the effort of maintaining his composure. The parallels between what Diana had endured and what they were facing now were uncomfortably clear, and Kate could see that William was struggling with his own memories of watching his mother be torn apart by media speculation and public judgment. "Yes, sweetheart," Kate said softly, "like that. But we're going to handle it differently. We're going to stay together and take care of each other, and we're not going to let mean people hurt our family." Louis, who had been listening with the incomplete understanding of a 6-year-old, suddenly looked up at Kate with wide eyes. "Are you sad, Mama?" he asked, reaching up to touch her cheek where a tear she hadn't realized she was shedding had left a trail. Kate's composure finally cracked completely. The innocence of the question, the simple love in her youngest child's voice, broke through all her attempts to stay strong for their sake. She gathered all 3 children close, feeling William's arms encompass them all, and let herself cry for the childhood innocence they were about to lose, for the normal family life that was slipping away from them minute by minute. "I'm sad," she admitted, "because some people want to hurt people I love. But I'm also happy because I have all of you, and we love each other, and that's stronger than anything anyone could say about us." George, with the serious demeanor that sometimes made him seem much older than his years, reached out to pat Kate's shoulder. "We won't believe the mean things," he promised. "And if anyone at school says something, I'll tell them they're wrong." Kate felt her heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. Her son's loyalty was fierce and beautiful, but she also knew that defending his family could make him a target for the kind of cruelty that children could inflict on each other when influenced by adult prejudices and scandals. Mrs. Henderson, who had been discreetly observing from across the room, approached quietly. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "it would be best if the children remained here at the castle for the next few days rather than attending their regular lessons. We can continue their studies privately until the situation stabilizes." Kate nodded gratefully, relieved that someone else had voiced what she had been thinking. The idea of sending her children out into the world right now, of letting them face questions and comment from teachers and classmates, felt impossible. As they prepared to leave the nursery, having promised the children they would return soon for dinner, Kate caught sight of a television in the corner of the room. The screen was dark now, but she knew that within hours it would be broadcasting images of her family, analyzing their every expression, dissecting their relationships, and offering commentary on allegations that felt like poison in the air. William seemed to read her thoughts. "We're going to fight this," he said quietly as they walked back toward Charles's study. "Not just with statements and traditional damage control. We're going to find out who's behind it and make them pay for what they've done to our family." Kate heard something in his voice that both reassured and worried her. William's anger was righteous, but it was also dangerous. In his determination to protect his family, would he make choices that could create even more problems for them all? When they returned to the study, they found Charles in heated conversation with several advisors who had arrived while they were with the children. The room buzzed with urgent, overlapping conversations about legal action, security measures, and media strategy. Kate felt overwhelmed by the number of people who suddenly seemed to have opinions about her life and her family's future. Camilla approached them as soon as they entered, her expression grave. "The story has broken," she announced. "Multiple outlets simultaneously. The timing suggests significant coordination." Kate sank into a chair, feeling the weight of inevitability settling over her like a heavy blanket. There was no going back now, no way to contain the damage or control the narrative. Whatever happened next, their lives would be forever divided into before and after this moment. One of the advisors, a sharp-faced woman Kate recognized as the head of Palace Communications, turned to address them directly. "The allegations are serious enough that we need to consider all options, including legal action for defamation. However, pursuing litigation could keep the story in the news longer and give the accusers additional platforms to repeat their claims." William's response was immediate and fierce. "They've threatened my family's safety and attacked my wife's character with lies. I don't care how long it keeps the story in the news. I want them destroyed." The room fell silent at the intensity of his words. Kate saw Charles exchange a meaningful look with Camilla, and she realized that her husband's reaction was exactly what they had feared. In his determination to protect his family, William was ready to abandon the careful, measured approach that had traditionally guided royal responses to scandal. "William," Charles said carefully, "I understand your anger, but we must think strategically about how to minimize long-term damage to the institution." Kate saw her husband's expression harden, and she knew that the fundamental disagreement between father and son was about to explode into open conflict. William wasn't just angry about the attacks on his family. He was furious at what he saw as his father's inadequate response to those attacks. "The institution," William repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Father, they've been watching our children. They violated our privacy in ways that could endanger everyone we love. And you're worried about the institution?" Kate realized that this crisis was about to become something much larger than allegations and media coverage. It was about to become a battle for the soul of the monarchy itself, fought between a king who believed in traditional restraint and an heir who was ready to fight fire with fire. The afternoon was far from over, and Kate could feel that the worst was yet to come. The confrontation between father and son erupted with a force that made everyone in the room step back. Kate watched in horror as years of suppressed tension between Charles and William finally exploded into the open, triggered by the crisis that was tearing their family apart. "You don't understand," William said, his voice rising despite his obvious efforts to maintain control. "This isn't like the scandals you've dealt with before. They're not just questioning our judgment or our lifestyle choices. They're making accusations that could destroy Kate's reputation permanently, and they're putting our children in actual physical danger." Charles straightened to his full height, every inch the monarch who had spent decades learning to command respect through presence alone. "You think I don't understand?" he replied, his own voice carrying the weight of authority earned through bitter experience. "I lived through the Diana years, William. I watched the media tear apart someone I cared about, watched them drive her to desperation with their relentless pursuit and constant accusations. Don't lecture me about understanding the cost of scandal. The mention of Diana hit William like a physical blow, and Kate saw him flinch as if his father had struck him. The comparison was both apt and cruel, highlighting the parallels between what Kate was facing and what Diana had endured, while also reminding William of how little Charles had been able to do to protect his first wife from the media savagery. And how did that work out? William shot back, his composure finally cracking completely. Your measured response, your dignified silence, your faith in the institution's ability to weather the storm? She's dead, Father. The woman you claim to have cared about is dead. And part of the reason is that you were too concerned with protocol to fight for her when she needed you most. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Kate saw Charles actually stagger backward as if he had been physically assaulted. The pain in his eyes was raw and devastating, the guilt he had carried for decades suddenly exposed for everyone in the room to see. Camilla moved instinctively toward Charles, her face pale with shock at the viciousness of William's attack. Kate realized that in his rage, her husband had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had inflicted a wound that might never heal. "William," Kate said sharply, finding her voice for the first time since the argument had begun. "Stop, please." But her husband was beyond reason, months or perhaps years of frustration pouring out in a torrent of accusation and recrimination. "No," he said, turning to face her with eyes that blazed with fury. "I'm tired of pretending that quiet dignity is going to solve this. I'm tired of watching you suffer while we craft careful statements and hope the storm blows over. They've crossed every line there is to cross, and I'm not going to respond with polite restraint." One of the advisors, an elderly man Kate recognized as someone who had served the family for decades, cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should postpone this discussion until emotions have cooled," he suggested. But William turned on him with such vehemence that the man actually stepped backward. "Emotions?" William laughed bitterly. "My wife is being systematically destroyed by lies. My children are being threatened, and you want to talk about cooling emotions? This is exactly the problem. You're all so focused on maintaining appearances that you've forgotten we're human beings with actual feelings and actual lives at stake." Kate felt as if she was watching her family disintegrate in real time. The unity that had sustained them through previous challenges was crumbling under the pressure of this crisis, revealing fault lines and resentments that had been hidden beneath years of careful royal training and public solidarity. Charles had recovered some of his composure, though Kate could see the effort it was costing him. "William," he said quietly, "I know you're frightened and angry. I know you want to protect your family. But if you let your emotions drive your response to this crisis, you'll make mistakes that will hurt the very people you're trying to defend. Like you protected my mother." William shot back, and Kate saw Charles flinch again at the renewed attack on what was clearly his most vulnerable point. Camilla finally found her voice, speaking with the authority of someone who had survived her own media hell. "That's enough," she said firmly, stepping between father and son. "This fighting serves no one, and it certainly doesn't help Kate or the children." William turned his anger on his stepmother, his face contorted with years of suppressed resentment. "Don't lecture me about helping Kate," he snarled. "You of all people should understand what it's like to watch someone you love being torn apart by media lies and public hatred. But instead of learning from that experience, you're counseling the same passive response that failed so spectacularly before." Kate watched Camilla absorb the attack with the stoicism of someone who had endured far worse. But she could see the hurt in her eyes. Whatever relationship had developed between William and Camilla over the years was being damaged, perhaps irreparably, by the pressure they were all under. "William, please," Kate said again, moving to stand beside him. "This isn't helping. We're all on the same side here." Her husband turned to her with an expression of such anguish that it took her breath away. "Are we?" he asked. "Because it seems to me that everyone in this room is more concerned with protecting the monarchy's reputation than with protecting you." The accusation was unfair, and Kate knew it, but she also understood the fear and frustration that was driving William's anger. He felt powerless to protect the people he loved most, trapped by protocols and traditions that seemed to prioritize institutional stability over human welfare. One of the communication advisors approached cautiously, holding a tablet that displayed what Kate assumed was the breaking news coverage. "Your Majesties," she said hesitantly, "we need to make a decision about our response. The story is spreading rapidly across all platforms, and several major news organizations are requesting comment." Charles moved toward the woman, grateful perhaps for the distraction from the family conflict that was tearing them apart. Kate followed, steeling herself to see how their private crisis was being presented to the world. The headlines were worse than she had imagined. "Kate Middleton accused of royal marriage plot," read one. "Security concerns surround Cambridge family," declared another. But it was the third headline that made Kate feel physically ill. Palace sources questioned Kate's fitness for future queen. The articles themselves were a masterpiece of innuendo and carefully worded accusations. They presented the allegations against Kate as coming from multiple sources close to the royal family, giving them an air of credibility that made them far more dangerous than obvious tabloid fabrications would have been. What made the coverage particularly devastating was its sophistication. These weren't the crude attack pieces of the royal family had learned to dismiss and counter. They were carefully crafted narratives that wove together true facts with false accusations in a way that made it difficult to refute one without seeming to validate the others. "They're calling for an official inquiry," the advisor continued, her voice tight with professional control that barely masked her personal distress. "Several members of Parliament are suggesting that the allegations are serious enough to warrant investigation by appropriate authorities." Kate felt the world tilt around her. An official inquiry would mean months or years of investigation, testimony, and public examination of every aspect of her life and marriage. Even if she was ultimately vindicated, the process itself would be its own form of punishment, an extended public humiliation that would touch every member of her family. William read the articles over her shoulder, and she could feel his rage intensifying with every paragraph. "This is coordinated," he said grimly. This level of organization, the simultaneous release across multiple platforms, the sophistication of the allegations. Someone with significant resources and inside knowledge is behind this. Charles nodded reluctantly. "The investigation is ongoing, but preliminary findings suggest you're right. This appears to be an orchestrated attack rather than opportunistic journalism." Kate felt a chill run down her spine. But who would have the resources and motivation to do something like this? She asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The response came from an unexpected source. Camilla, who had been quietly reviewing documents at Charles's desk, looked up with an expression that was both grim and oddly satisfied. "I believe I may have some insight into that question," she said, and Kate noticed that her voice carried a hardness that hadn't been there before. She approached the group with a file in her hands, her movements precise and controlled. "While you were arguing," she said pointedly, looking between Charles and William, "I was reviewing the security reports and cross-referencing them with some intelligence I've been gathering privately." Kate was surprised by this revelation. She hadn't known that Camilla had been conducting her own investigation, but it made sense given her experience with media attacks and her understanding of the palace's vulnerabilities. "What kind of intelligence?" Charles asked, his tone suggesting both curiosity and concern about what his wife might have discovered. Camilla opened the file and spread several photographs and documents across the desk. Kate recognized some of the images as surveillance photos of their family, but others showed people she didn't recognize meeting in what appeared to be clandestine circumstances. "The surveillance equipment found on the palace grounds wasn't random," Camilla explained. "The placement was too sophisticated, too carefully planned. Someone with detailed knowledge of your family's routines and habits had to be involved in positioning it." Kate studied the photographs, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. One image showed a man she didn't recognize handing an envelope to someone whose face was obscured by shadows. Another captured what appeared to be a covert meeting in a parking garage, the participants carefully avoiding direct camera angles. This suggests a level of planning and coordination that goes far beyond simple financial motivation, Camilla continued. Someone has been systematically gathering information about your family for months, possibly years. William moved closer to examine the evidence, his anger now focused and directed rather than explosive and unfocused. Kate could see him shifting from the emotional response of a husband and father to the analytical approach of someone trained in strategic thinking. "Do we know who any of these people are?" he asked, pointing to the surveillance photos. Camilla nodded grimly. "Some of them. What's interesting is the pattern of connections. Financial transactions that trace back to organizations with political agendas, communication patterns that suggest coordination with media outlets known for their Republican sympathies." Kate felt a new kind of fear settle in her stomach. Political motivation was somehow more terrifying than personal malice or simple greed. It suggested that the attacks on her family were part of a larger strategy, a calculated campaign designed to weaken or destroy the monarchy itself. "They're using us as weapons against the institution," she said quietly, the full scope of the situation finally becoming clear to her. "This isn't really about me at all. It's about finding a way to damage the monarchy that the public will accept and support." Charles nodded slowly, his expression grave. "A direct attack on the crown would rally public support behind us," he said. "But an attack on the character and fitness of future monarchs, particularly if it appears to come from credible sources within the establishment itself, is much more effective." Kate realized that she and William had become pawns in a game much larger than their personal lives. The allegations against her weren't just meant to destroy her reputation. They were designed to plant seeds of doubt about the institution's future, to make the public question whether the monarchy could be trusted to choose suitable leaders. William had reached the same conclusion, and his expression was darker than Kate had ever seen it. "So we're not just fighting for our family's reputation," he said. "We're fighting for the survival of the monarchy itself." The weight of that realization settled over all of them like a shroud. Kate had always known that her position came with enormous responsibility, but she had never imagined that her personal character could become the battleground on which the future of an ancient institution would be decided. "What do we do?" she asked, looking around the room at the advisors and family members who were supposed to have answers for exactly this kind of crisis. Camilla was the first to respond, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived her own character assassination and emerged stronger. "We fight back," she said simply, "but we fight smart. We use the evidence we're gathering to expose the conspiracy behind these attacks. We don't just defend against the allegations. We go on the offensive against the people who created them." Charles looked uncomfortable with this approach, his preference for dignified restraint clearly at odds with Camilla's more aggressive strategy. But William nodded immediately, his expression showing the first sign of satisfaction Kate had seen from him all day. "Finally," he said, "a plan that actually involves fighting back instead of just enduring the attack." Kate felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She wanted to fight for her family and her reputation, but she also understood Charles's concerns about escalating a situation that was already spiraling out of control. "What exactly does fighting back mean?" she asked, needing to understand what they were committing themselves to. Camilla smiled, and for the first time that day, Kate saw something predatory in her expression. "It means we stop playing defense and start playing offense. We expose the people behind this conspiracy, we reveal their motivations, and we make them pay for what they've tried to do to your family." As the afternoon wore on and their strategy began to take shape, Kate realized that this crisis was going to change all of them in fundamental ways. The naive belief that dignified silence could protect them from malicious attacks was being stripped away, replaced by a harder, more cynical understanding of the world they lived in. Whatever emerged from this battle, Kate knew that none of them would ever be the same. 3 weeks later, Kate stood at the same window where this nightmare had begun, but everything had changed. The woman who gazed out at the perfectly manicured gardens bore little resemblance to the devastated figure who had wept in this room while reading those first accusations. The tears had been replaced by a steely determination, the trembling hands now steady with purpose. Behind her, the study buzzed with controlled activity. What had started as a crisis management meeting had evolved into something resembling a war room, with investigators, legal advisors, and communication specialists working around the clock to unravel the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed her family. The breakthrough had come 5 days ago, when their investigators had finally connected all the dots. The attack on Kate hadn't been random or opportunistic. It had been the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign spanning nearly 2 years, funded by a coalition of Republican activists and foreign entities with vested interests in destabilizing the British monarchy. Kate turned from the window as Camilla entered the room, carrying yet another folder of evidence. Over the past weeks, her relationship with her stepmother-in-law had transformed from polite distance to genuine partnership. Camilla's experience with surviving character assassination had proved invaluable, but more than that, her willingness to fight dirty when necessary had given their response an edge that traditional royal protocols would never have allowed. The financial records are definitive, Camilla announced to the room at large. We can trace the funding for the entire operation back to 3 main sources: a Republican organization based in Scotland, a media manipulation firm with ties to several hostile foreign governments, and a technology company that specializes in surveillance equipment. William looked up from the legal documents he had been reviewing, his expression showing the same transformation that Kate had undergone. The explosive anger of those first days had been channeled into a focused determination that was far more dangerous to their enemies than his initial emotional response had been. "Do we have enough to go public?" he asked, and Kate heard in his voice the same steel that had emerged in her own character over the past weeks. Charles, who had spent the early days of the crisis advocating for restraint and traditional responses, nodded grimly. "More than enough. The evidence is overwhelming." What they did goes far beyond simple defamation. They engaged in systematic surveillance, harassment, and what amounts to a conspiracy to overthrow a constitutional monarchy. Kate felt a surge of satisfaction at her father-in-law's transformation as well. The man who had initially counseled patience and dignity had become the architect of a counterattack that would expose not just the specific conspiracy against their family, but the broader network of organizations working to undermine democratic institutions across Europe. "What about the palace sources mentioned in the original articles?" Kate asked, referring to the accusations that had hurt most deeply, the claims that people within the royal household had questioned her fitness and character. Camilla's expression hardened. "We've identified them all. 3 staff members who were either blackmailed or bribed into providing information, and 2 others who were actually planted within the household specifically to gather intelligence." The betrayal still stung, but Kate had learned to channel that pain into determination. The people who had violated their trust, who had endangered her children and attempted to destroy her marriage, would face consequences. Not just dismissal or quiet resignation, but full legal prosecution for their crimes. William stood and moved to stand beside Kate at the window, his presence steady and reassuring in a way that had become even more precious over the weeks of crisis. "Are we ready to release everything?" he asked, and Kate heard the question beneath the question, "Are we prepared for the war that this will start?" Because releasing their evidence wouldn't just clear Kate's name or expose the specific conspiracy against their family. It would reveal the existence of a coordinated international effort to destabilize democratic institutions, an effort that had been operating in shadow for years. The implications went far beyond royal scandal into the realm of national security and international relations. "The Prime Minister has been briefed," Charles said in response to his son's unspoken concerns, "as have the heads of our intelligence services and several allied governments whose own institutions have been targeted by similar operations. Everyone agrees that exposure is necessary, regardless of the consequences. Kate thought about those consequences as she watched gardeners working in the ground below. Once they released their evidence, there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that attacks on public figures were simply the price of fame or the natural result of media competition. They would be acknowledging that democracy itself was under assault from forces that operated without regard for truth, dignity, or human decency. But the alternative, allowing the conspiracy to succeed, letting the lies stand unchallenged, was unthinkable. Not just for their family, but for every other public figure who might be targeted by similar campaigns in the future. "There's something else," Camilla said, and Kate heard a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. "Our investigators have discovered that this operation was intended as a test case. If they could successfully destroy Kate's reputation and damage the monarchy's standing, they plan to export the same techniques to target other royal families, elected officials, and democratic institutions across Europe and beyond." Kate felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't just been a victim. She had been an experiment, a test subject for techniques that could be used to undermine democracy itself. The personal violation of the attacks on her family paled in comparison to the broader implications of what they had uncovered. "So we're not just fighting for ourselves," William said, echoing Kate's thoughts. "We're fighting for everyone who might be targeted by these methods in the future." One of the legal advisors, a sharp-faced woman who had been working 18-hour days for the past 2 weeks, looked up from her laptop. "The first arrests will be made tomorrow morning," she announced. "Coordinated actions in London, Edinburgh, and 3 other European capitals. The media campaign will begin simultaneously." Kate felt her stomach tighten with anticipation and anxiety. Tomorrow, the story would shift from accusations against her to revelations about the conspiracy behind those accusations. The headlines would change from questioning her character to examining the methods used by those who had attacked her. But she also knew that the people behind this conspiracy wouldn't go down quietly. Exposing them would likely trigger counterattacks, additional revelations, and possibly even more dangerous forms of retaliation. They were about to start a war with enemies who had already proven their willingness to cross any line to achieve their goals. "What about the children?" she asked, voicing the concern that kept her awake at night. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been shielded from the worst of the crisis over the past weeks, but tomorrow's revelations would thrust them back into the spotlight in ways that could be even more dangerous than the original attacks. William's jaw tightened. "Enhanced security measures are already in place," he said, "and we've prepared age-appropriate explanations for all of them. They need to understand that what's happening isn't about us having done something wrong, but about bad people trying to hurt good institutions." Kate nodded, though part of her worried about the long-term effects of exposing her children to such adult concepts of conspiracy and political manipulation. How do you explain to a child that there are people in the world who will lie, cheat, and threaten innocent families in pursuit of abstract political goals? As if reading her thoughts, Camilla approached and placed a gentle hand on Kate's arm. "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for," she said softly. "And teaching them early about the existence of evil in the world also teaches them to recognize and resist it. You're not destroying their innocence. You're giving them the tools to protect themselves." Kate found comfort in Camilla's words, partly because they came from someone who had lived through her own public destruction and emerged stronger, and partly because she could see the truth in them. Her children would grow up in a world where digital manipulation and coordinated disinformation campaigns were facts of life. Better to teach them to recognize these threats than to leave them vulnerable to future attacks. The communication advisor, who had been silent for most of the afternoon, suddenly spoke up. "We have a problem," she said, her voice tight with tension. "Someone has leaked the fact that arrests are planned for tomorrow. Several of our targets have already left the country." Kate felt her heart sink. The careful coordination that had been planned, the simultaneous actions that were supposed to prevent the conspiracy's leaders from escaping or destroying evidence, had been compromised. Once again, their enemies seemed to be one step ahead of them. But William's reaction surprised her. Instead of the anger or frustration she expected, he actually smiled. "Good," he said, and everyone in the room turned to stare at him. "Let them run. Flight is an admission of guilt, and it leaves their subordinates behind to face the consequences alone." People facing serious jail time have a way of becoming very talkative about their former employers. Kate realized that her husband had learned more than she had initially appreciated about the strategic aspects of the battle they were fighting. The young man who had exploded with emotional fury 3 weeks ago had been replaced by someone who thought several moves ahead and understood that sometimes apparent setbacks could be turned into advantages. Charles nodded approvingly at his son's analysis. "Besides," he added, "we have extradition treaties with most of the countries where they're likely to flee. Running just delays their arrest. It doesn't prevent it." As the day wore on and their final preparations were completed, Kate found herself thinking about the person she had been before this crisis began. That woman seemed almost naive now, trusting in the basic decency of people and institutions in a way that was no longer possible. But she wasn't sure the transformation was entirely negative. Yes, she had lost some innocence and trust, but she had gained strength, purpose, and a deeper understanding of the world her children would inherit. She was no longer the somewhat reluctant royal who had married into duty. She was a woman who had chosen to fight for the values and institutions she believed in. That evening, as they prepared for what would likely be the most important press conference of their lives, Kate stood once again at the window where this journey had begun. But this time, she wasn't alone. William stood beside her, his hand in hers, while Camilla and Charles reviewed final details of the desk behind them. "Are you ready?" William asked quietly, and Kate knew he wasn't just asking about the press conference or the media storm that would follow their revelations. He was asking if she was ready to be the kind of royal, the kind of public figure who fought back against attacks instead of simply enduring them. He was asking if she was prepared to live in a world where their private lives would always be potential battlegrounds for larger political conflicts. Kate squeezed his hand and looked out at the gardens where her children played under the watchful eyes of security personnel who were no longer a precaution but a necessity. She thought about the life they might have had if they had never discovered the conspiracy, if they had simply accepted the accusations and tried to move on with damaged reputations and diminished trust. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The press conference the next morning would reveal the full scope of the conspiracy that had targeted their family. The arrests would expose the international network of organizations working to undermine democratic institutions. The evidence would vindicate Kate's character and restore her family's reputation. But more than that, it would send a message to anyone who might consider similar attacks in the future. The British royal family was no longer a passive target for political manipulation. They had learned to fight back, and they had the resources, intelligence, and determination to win. As Kate prepared to face the cameras that would carry their story around the world, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in just 3 weeks. The woman who had wept in Camilla's presence was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes tears were a luxury that couldn't be afforded. The truth would set them free, but freedom, they had learned, was something that had to be fought for and defended. And Kate was ready for that fight. Standing at the podium, looking out at the assembled journalists who would carry their story across the globe, Kate felt the weight of history on her shoulders. What they were about to reveal would change the public's understanding of how modern political warfare operated, would expose the sophisticated methods being used to manipulate democratic societies. But it would also demonstrate that those methods could be detected, exposed, and defeated by people willing to fight for truth and institutional integrity. Kate began to speak, her voice steady and clear, carrying the story of conspiracy and betrayal that had nearly destroyed her family, and how they had turned that attack into a victory for transparency and justice. The woman who had once wept while Camilla watched had become someone who could make her enemies weep instead. The war was far from over, but they had won the first battle, and Kate knew they were prepared for whatever came next.